let me tell you about Elaine. She's been a good friend of the Faraday, been working with us for quite some years in various projects. She holds a chair in social sciences and is a professor of sociology at Rice University. Though she's not come from the States today, she's come from Switzerland, where she's on study leave for a few months, so she's getting the European tour. She got a PhD in 2004 at Cornell. She also she's a founding director of the Religion and Public Life program at Rice. And the sort of things she researches, some of which she'll be talking about today, is looking at how individuals use race and gender and religious identities to bring changes to religious and scientific institutions. And she's certainly published another book, which there's one of downstairs on family relationships. I think I nattered on long enough to give the last people time to find their way here, so I'll stop talking now. Let me hand over to Elaine.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for that gracious introduction, Bob. It's really wonderful to be here. I want to start by telling you a bit of a story. So I remember when, about 10 years ago, I started thinking about what scientists in different national contexts think about God and religion more broadly. You see, I study people, and it's become kind of comic in our household because my husband's a particle physicist, and so he studies particles, and we have lots of differences between our research subjects, right, particles and people. And one, I think, namely, is that rarely do my husband's research subjects speak to him, right? So he would be thought of as a little bit crazed if he started talking about how his particles speak to him. I think they probably speak to him metaphorically, but he doesn't hear the audible voice of his particles. On the other hand, as a social scientist, the people that I study actually speak to me. They tell me their stories, and sometimes they change the whole course of my research direction. My research respondents, the people that I work with, actually give me whole new research ideas and directions. And that happened to me over 10 years ago when I was sitting in a lab at Stanford University with a scientist named Anuj. You see, then I was doing a study of US scientists and what they think about religion. And I asked Anuj how scientists think about religion, and I asked him specifically whether he thought that there was a conflict between religion and science. And he kind of looked puzzled. He was clearly an Indian immigrant, but he had his children in the US. He received much of his formative scientific training in the US. But he did pause and look at me directly. And he said, why do you Americans talk so much about the conflict between religion and science? He said, as a Hindu, I never talk in these terms. I ask questions like, how does religion come to bear on my science? How does my science come to bear on my religion? He said, if anything, my faith makes me think more deeply about the ways that science might enter faith and faith might enter science. So fast forward 6 years later, I started thinking about these topics a lot more. I actually worked some of these issues out right here in the Faraday Institute at Cambridge, had lots of conversations with some of you. And I was very fortunate to get a grant from the Templeton World Charity Foundation to do a cross-national study of 8 different nations and what scientists think about religion, spirituality, and the intersections between those, if they exist, and their scientific work. And I felt awesome. That was the first sort of emotion that I had. And then, as some of you know, when you get a research grant, first you feel just so great about it, and then the reality sets in that I had agreed to survey 22,000 scientists in 8 different national contexts, and then to do follow-up interviews with about 600 to 700 of them. And then a sense of panic set in. And some of you also know that feeling for those of you who are researchers. After your awesomeness, you realize that, wow, I really need help with this. And so in addition to the Faraday Institute and the TWCF, I have other people to thank. Some of them started as my close personal friends, and then I sent them around the world to do interviews with scientists. So in total, 101 people worked on this study. And that includes postdoctoral fellows, full-time research staff, subcontractors, PhD level students, and university students. And our initial aim of this study, the significance of this study, was so important to us, trying to understand what scientists around these different national contexts think about the intersection between faith and science and spirituality and religion. It was significant because religion itself is such a significant force worldwide. So according to one of the recent Pew studies, 5.8 billion individuals, or nearly 84% of the global population, thinks of themselves as religious to some extent. And science is incredibly significant. So another statistic for you, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that in 2007, the global science and engineering workforce in OECD countries was 4.2 million. That's a much smaller number, of course, than the proportion of people that are religious. But I think you know intuitively that any nation that is trying to grow economically, that is trying to be a more global nation, is also trying to grow its scientific infrastructure. And as religion lives live and science continues to grow, the science and faith interface also lives large in the public imagination around the world. We know this intuitively, of course, just down the street in Oxford. Richard Dawkins has written, of course, a very famous book by now, The God Delusion, which has shown up on New York Times bestseller lists for me across the pond. It's certainly received and known about here. We also have someone like Sam Harris writing very prolifically. This is one of his recent books, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. We have other kinds of accounts of scientists, some written by those in this very room, of how they understand the intersection between their own faith and their scientific work. Francis Collins is one of the more famous of these, the current director of the National Institutes of Health in the US. We don't know if that, well, don't ask me anything about American politics during this lecture. I should have said that at the outset, just so we can all be on the same page about that. Okay, just wanted to get that out. So we'll see if Collins remains. So these kinds of books, in some ways, are responding to this sense of a conflict paradigm. These either personal faith accounts of scientists or these accounts of scientists railing against faith. But we also know that historians, philosophers, and theologians in many ways tell us, those in this room are probably inherently interested in this issue, the science and faith interface, have read widely most likely. You will be familiar with work that shows in those disciplines then science and faith are not inherently in conflict, that there's not an inherent conflict between them. The Reverend Dr. John Polkinghorne, of course, has written, if we were seeking to serve the God of truth, then we should really welcome truth from whatever source it comes. We shouldn't fear the truth. Some of it will be from science, obviously, but by no means all of it. It will sometimes by perplexing how this bit of truth relates to that bit of truth. We know, though, that within science itself, often enough, and we find it outside of science as well, the crucial thing is to be honest. But we also know that the perception that there is a science and faith conflict, and this is what social science brings to these kinds of debates, actually lives large in the public imagination. In the US, no matter, depends how you look at it, have the good fortune or not so good fortune of being from Texas in the United States. And I have done some surveys both in Texas but also in the US more broadly, and well over 50% of the US population thinks that there's an inherent conflict between religion and science, and even more, about 75% of the US population thinks that scientists themselves are inherently hostile to religious people and religious ideas. So So there's a very real sense, so whether or not we believe that it's true in an absolute, ideologic, philosophic, theological sense, in a very real practice sense, there is the idea that's living and being practiced by people of faith, by people in the scientific community, that there is a conflict. And that means, as social scientists, we need to start to study whether or not that's really the case, under what conditions it's the case. And so that's where social science, I think, helps us in particular kinds of ways, helps us understand what everyday people think about these sort of issues. So remember, our project here was to look across these 8 national contexts, to gather information about scientists in those contexts, and to try to figure out really how they're approaching these issues. So let me give you an at-a-glance sense of what we did. So our 8 international contexts are the following: France, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, United Kingdom, and US. These are nations with different levels of scientific infrastructure, different understandings of religion in the populace, different relationships between religious institutions and the state, different regions of the world. Happy to answer questions later about why we picked these particular nations, but suffice to say they vary on the kinds of things that we think are important to this interface. We looked at 2 disciplines, biology and physics, and all of the subfields within those disciplines. Science is located both in universities, often in universities, but also in research institutes and places outside of universities. So we tried to gather information about the entirety of those 2 disciplines in these national contexts. These are disciplines which historically and presently have had some kind of science and faith interface. Biology, of course, more publicly, more recently. We started out with a really, really big list. So a list actually of 61,020 biologists and physicists. These were the people that we deemed through a variety of methods are eligible to be in our study. You remember those 101 research assistants and researchers that I worked with. So this list did not drop from the sky, given by we do believe that it was God-given in the end, but we did work very hard to create this list. So it actually took us almost 18 months to put together this list. So a lot of stalking scientists and trying to get their contact information. University students very good at this kind of thing, trying to figure out where people live, what their addresses and what their emails are. So they were very, very useful. Then we took a random sample, according to the kinds of things we were interested in, of 22,525 scientists. And those were the scientists that we sent our survey to. So 22,525 scientists. And we were fortunate enough to have 9,422 of them respond. Now, I don't know if you've taken surveys. I'm imagining that everyone, is there anyone in this room who hasn't taken a survey? That's okay, so that's no one has not, maybe 1 or 2 of you, I won't put anyone on the spot. But if you understand what a survey is, I, the researcher, choose your categories for you, right? So if I'm going to give you a survey about religion, I tell you, this the divine researcher, what your particular categories of religion are. Surveys inherently box people in. We actually create little boxes that people check off. That is just all fine and well, and it's very good to be able to ask people across social contexts the same question so we can compare people, but they're a little bit unsatisfactory, especially when it comes to something that's as complicated as religion and attitudes towards religion. So to that end, we actually got on planes, we got on trains in some cases, we drove around the US, and we interviewed scientists, most of them face-to-face. We did 609 in-depth interviews, and for those of you who've conducted interviews, that's a very large set of interviews, but they were wonderful, wonderful things to have the privilege to do. This study asks lots and lots of different questions. We finished the very last piece of data collection at the very beginning of this year in 2016. And so we're still combing through these mountains of data. But tonight I want to go through 4 kinds of very specific questions with you and give you at least some initial insight into the answers to these questions. So here are the questions. Do scientists believe in God? Now, that is not a terribly nuanced question, right? But as I said before, you will find that in many publics, especially in the US, but I suspect in other publics as well, there is the perception that they can't or that they don't. So we'll start there, and then we'll ask deeper questions about the kind of God they believe in or don't believe in. Who are scientists religiously? So what kind of religious sensibilities do they have? What kind of religious traditions do they have? And then how do they compare to the general public in their particular national context? Thirdly, is the conflict paradigm, which I talked about at the beginning, empirically accurate? Is it real in the lives of scientists? So we wanted to know that as well. And to what extent does religion ever enter scientific work? So some of you will be familiar with the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould's idea of non-overlapping magisterium, the idea that religion and science are divided, deal with different pieces of reality. And we'll try to address some of that tonight to try to figure out the extent to which religion ever enters scientific work and how it might differently in these different kinds of national contexts. So let me give you a little bit more detail about our study. So here's how our survey went. I told you 9,422, which is a pretty high response rate for this kind of survey research. But that number in and of itself obscures some of the differences in response rates in these different national contexts. So we had fairly high response rates in Italy, in the UK, in the US. And we find, though, that in other national contexts, people were a little bit harder to reach. Surveys involve trying to get a hold of people and get them to do something in real-life historical context. So during the course of this study, there was quite important and massive upheaval and political unrest in both Hong Kong and in Turkey. And these were situations where people were deeply involved and embedded in their political context. And the last thing they were thinking about doing is doing a survey. I actually started the survey in Hong Kong right before the political unrest and then stopped the survey and then went back a year later to re-up after things became a little bit calmer. But according to the national opinion research firms in the US, these are very high response rates, and we're very, very pleased and fortunate that scientists responded to the study. Our survey included 77 questions. We know that religion does not operate in a vacuum. It's influenced by lots of other social factors. And so to that end, we also ask questions about things which social scientists know sometimes have an impact on religion. So we also ask questions about gender and ethics and family life. We ask questions about the commercial application of science and the extent to which scientists thought about this, to which they had a moral framework and for understanding commercial application of science. Thinking about some of those variables, some of the things that we asked about in our survey, let me break the data down in another way. In terms of discipline, 45% of those who responded are biologists, 55% are physicists, 69% have a PhD. We also studied scientists at all ranks, at all places in the career trajectory. So that meant that we studied scientists who don't have a PhD, those who are in training, who are on the way to get a PhD. We also studied scientists who are in the middle of their careers, scientists who are in the latter part of their careers, thinking that these kinds of issues might be different at different points in the life course of being a scientist. 33% of our sample is women. This shows you that there's pretty massive underrepresentation of women in certain disciplines, and particularly in certain subfields of science. Women are much better represented in biology than they are in physics. This 33% was achieved even through an oversample of women. So even after we took more women into the population of those we were surveyed than are present in the real numbers of the population. So that's even after an oversample. 21% of scientists in our study are foreign-born. This is much higher in certain nations. In the US, it goes up to, depending on discipline, 30 or even 40%. in certain subfields of physics and biology. In the UK, it's quite high as well. In some nations, it's less. But this shows you that science is global, and you might start imagining, as I'm talking, how the global nature of science, how the transfer of people among national contexts might have an impact on the religious character of the scientific community in those nations. And that resulted in some fascinating things in our study. I told you that we also wanted to do face-to-face conversations or phone or Skype conversations with scientists. We wanted to actually get into their context to understand how they see things, they hear things in their own terms, in their scientific work, in their own personal lives. So to that end, we did in-depth interviews with biologists and physicists. We also wanted to figure out how scientists who self-identify as being completely without religion, being slightly religious, being non-religious. We wanted to understand how those different categories of scientists see the science and faith interface, see the importance or lack of importance, really, of religion in their lives. So we selected, according to our survey results, a sample of those who identified in each of these categories. So there were many more non-religious scientists than religious scientists, so we selected a few more religious scientists into our interview sample in order to make sure their voices were heard. Scientists who think of themselves as slightly religious or spiritual and not religious, we selected these categories of people into our interview sample. We did 609 interviews. That too obscures some of the reality of doing interviews in these national contexts. So our interviews were done in 7 different languages. I listed them there. Sometimes you would get a request from a scientist who wanted to be interviewed, in English. Obviously, we had more capability to interview people in English, being a US-based research team, than we did to interview people in other languages, although we also had facility in those other languages. And you would get to the interview and realize that the person actually was an international in the context. This happened both in the US and the UK. And while he or she could talk about matters of science very competently in English, did not have the vocabulary at all to talk about matters of faith. And so we have these really interesting, of course, language is very domain specific. We have these very interesting interviews where the interviewer is saying, go ahead, speak Mandarin. This also happened in Italy, speak Italian. I don't actually speak that language, but someone on our team does. So I'll ask you the question in English. You respond in Mandarin, and we'll have the person who's back at home translate for you. That didn't happen very often, but there was this kind of interesting thing that happened in the study with social science methods, where you just have to respond as you go, because you're always encountering, as the researcher, really unexpected things. But that makes it so interesting and so fun and worthwhile to do. Another vantage point of these data is to let you know that this resulted in 12,180 pages of transcribed materials, which is a lot of paper. And so we did not actually print them all out, just so I don't want anyone to think that I've wasted that much paper. But the amount of data that we have is just enormous. So I'm hoping to, maybe even someone's in this room tonight who would like to help me analyze this data. I'm hoping to gather even more people who are interested in this project who want to help analyze these data and use it. So let's start with this first question, perhaps a kind of narrowly worded question, but I think it gives us a starting point. So do scientists believe in God? So we're looking at it this way. The belief that there is no God, the sort of convinced atheist view. So if the people in blue are the scientists and the people in green are members of the general population. So we utilize survey questions that have been asked in national surveys, public access data. And so that allowed us some degree of comparability between scientists and the general population. So we think of France as being a particularly secular nation, but among scientists, 51% are what we call convinced atheists, but only 17% of the French public sees themselves as convinced atheists. Also in the UK and the US, very big gaps between the science population and members of the general public. So if you're thinking along the lines tonight about what it would mean to have good dialogue between scientists and a religious public, something that's going to be a big hurdle is the magnitude of difference between those groups of people religiously, right? So it's going to potentially be easier to have dialogue if scientists are religiously similar to the general public than if they're really religiously different. There may be more hurdles, we would suspect. So that's something to think about. But if you look at I put this graph up according to difference in descending order. So if you look at Italy, also there's a big difference, but you see that many fewer scientists there rather are convinced atheists. In Taiwan, not very many scientists are convinced atheists, neither members of the general public. In India, not very many. In Turkey, almost no one is a convinced atheist. So very different contexts. Of course, these numbers obscure some of the depth of meaning, right? Like some of you are inherently dissatisfied with this, right? You're like, what does that mean? What do you mean by God, right? So, okay. So there is the sense, I think, pretty pervasively, I know from studies of the general population, that all atheism is the same, okay? Those of you in this room probably have a more nuanced view of that than I do, or than members of the general public. Maybe you had that view for a long time. But you can see where members of the general public get the view that there's a monolithic atheism. Here's a pretty famous quote from Richard Dawkins that I've heard others use. Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Faith is the belief in spite of, excuse me, even perhaps because of the lack of evidence. Okay, so that's the sense that there's kind of one atheism, and that atheism is very well represented by someone like Richard Dawkins. I hate to always use his quotes, but he's so colorful. I would say that the way that I was changed the most by this study, if you had asked me when I started this work about 10 years ago whether or not I thought scientists could be religious, I would have said, of course. And maybe members of the general public don't think that, but I, as a researcher, know scientists who are people of faith, know scientists from my own church who are very committed Christians. So this was not really a problem for me. I wanted to uncover how wide my own sense was, but this wasn't really a problem. I would tell you that my view of atheism was pretty much the same as that of the general public that I've since studied. I thought there's probably one kind of atheism. You just don't believe in God. I love it as a researcher when my view is changed by a study. And I would say that the way in which my view has been changed most is through uncovering that there are really atheisms and varieties of non-religion more broadly, and really dispelling my own stereotypes about the atheist community. And I and my students are doing some writing about this right now. But I found that there is such a diversity in atheism in the scientific community globally. And I'm going to put up for you 3 types of atheist scientists that we've discovered, and know that we're in the process of discovery of many more. But let me just talk to you about 3 that are pretty prevalent in our analyses so far. Here's an interview with an Italian professor. She's a biologist. She says, I think I am a spiritual person, but I'm not religious. She says she's a very committed atheist, but she believes in spiritual matters like relationships, love, respect, romantic feelings even, or humanitarian feelings. So that is very spiritual. I believe that people should be happy. I believe the world should improve. And interesting with this woman who, very well-known scientist in her context, she went on in the interview to describe how her spiritual atheism, she thought, made her very different from non-spiritual atheists, who she thought probably didn't care as much about their students, probably didn't want to do good in the world, weren't thinking much about how their lives impacted the world. And so she was using this as a kind of boundary marker between herself and other scientists who are atheists. So she thought of herself very distinctively as a special kind of atheist, as a spiritual atheist. She wasn't alone. This is coming up in quite a prevalent way. Secondly, there were atheists. This was in the words of one of our respondents. It's wonderful to interview really smart, reflective people. They give you all kinds of interesting subtitles for slides and books and things. So So this one said, I'm an atheist, but I have religious, or I might say spiritual aspirations. But here's what this looks like. Here's a US professor of biology, and he says this: let's put it this way, I aspire to be a spiritual person. To me, it's almost like a kind of a golden rule type of thing. It's sort of about aspiring to be good, not to be completely self-centered and have everything focused back on me and my own concerns. So maybe it's not very high-level spiritual thinking, because like I don't really worry about these things like the afterlife. It's also kind of fun when you do an interview and you can tell that you're introducing ideas that the person hasn't been thinking about. And so as we went on in this interview, he did actually start to think about the afterlife quite a bit as I asked him more and more questions about religion and things. So it was kind of interesting. But this is someone who's certainly not hostile to religious people or against them in any way, someone who in his own terms has spiritual aspirations. Then and this was very common in the UK, there are those who call themselves church-going atheists. So here's a physicist in the UK who says, I have no problem going to church services. It's like looking at another part of your culture. But I have no faith religiously, but it doesn't worry me that religion is still out there. So this person actually is a very regular church attender. A fun part of this survey is that scientists have faith practices and ways of thinking about things that are, I think, perhaps different than some in the general public. And so I did not keep the same kind of skip patterns in the survey. So let me tell you what that means in researcher terms. So skip patterns are when you answer a question on a survey and I say, well, you answering that question that way rules you out of answering other questions. So I'll let you skip those other questions. So usually when sociologists of religion ask people whether or not they are atheists and they say, yes, I am an atheist, they don't go on to ask them where they attend church, right? So this is the way in which we usually set up surveys. I actually think that's not good, right? So if I had put in those conventional skip patterns, we would not have discovered some of the categories that we discovered. And I wonder if we're not discovering in the general public if perhaps we're setting up our surveys with the wrong categories as well. So for those of you who are into these kind of research studies, you might try that on and see what you think of that idea. Then we wanted to ask, who are scientists religiously? So one way social scientists look at this is simply to ask scientists whether or not they identify as religious. In some ways, I'm quite a fan of this question because it doesn't actually get into the particularities of religion, but it asks more generally about the category, which is comparable across these national contexts. So if you're looking for scientists to be religious, if you want them to be religious, in one sense, this could be a glass half empty kind of story. So if you look at France, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Hong Kong, we have scientists in those regions of the world not really very likely to identify as being religious. But if we look at scientists in Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, and India, the picture gets a little bit different, that scientists there are a good deal more likely to identify as being religious. Another way we can look at this is how they compare again to the general population and whether or not there are gaps, right? Whether or not there are gaps. So again, you see that in France, there's a pretty big gap. In the United Kingdom, there's a pretty big gap. In the United States, there's a pretty big gap between scientists and the general population. And so you might start asking yourselves, what does this do to dialogue about science and faith in these national contexts? You see that in Italy and Turkey, there's a little bit less of a gap, but still a gap. You see that in Hong Kong and Taiwan, it's actually reverse, where interestingly, scientists are a bit more religious than those in the general population. And I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer if you want to talk about that more. But we've been thinking a good deal about that and really combing our interviews for answers to that question and think we have some plausible ideas. Let's look at the particular religious traditions of scientists. So in India, we see that about 79% of scientists identify as Hindu. That's a complicated category, which has both ethnic connotations as well as religious connotations for some. We found this very powerfully in our interviews. In Italy, 56% of scientists identify as Catholic. In Taiwan, there's some more religious diversity in the dominant religious traditions. We see Protestantism making a showing, but also Buddhism, other kinds of traditional folk beliefs, which sometimes overlap with other religious categories. In Turkey, 73% of scientists identify as Muslim. Then we can look at things like attendance and other kinds of practices. So religious traditions that are dominant in these countries vary, but let's look at them through the lens of attendance just for a minute. So these are biologists and physicists who attend religious services once a month or more. So in Turkey, we see not that much of a gap between those scientists, the members of the general public. In Turkey, attendance at religious services is probably not the dominant religious practice, but more prayers would be the dominant religious practice. And so we look at that in other research that we put out. In India, we see that there's a bit of a gap between the general population and scientists. In Italy, there's quite a bit of a gap between the general population and scientists. In Taiwan and Hong Kong, again, there's a closer approximation just of this attendance measure if we look at that. So let's now go to this other, to looking at how scientists see the relationship between religion and science. So those of us who are theologians or philosophers in the room will answer simply no to this question, that this is not an inherent reality, that science and faith have to be in conflict. But we, remember, are asking now, just for the sake of looking at things through a different lens, if this is empirically accurate. So how do people understand the relationship between religion and science? How do they understand it to work out in their own lives? So here's the numbers. So you see that there certainly is a minority of scientists who consider religion and science definitely to inherently be in conflict. So we asked them this question to respond to this question. For me personally, my understanding of science and religion can be described as a relationship of, and you see the categories that we gave them. So about a quarter or even a third in some of the national contexts consider religion and science to be in conflict, and they consider themselves to be on the side of science. Almost no one consider them to be conflicted on the side of religion. That makes some sense intuitively to me because they're scientists. You do see, though, that the majority see science and religion as in independent kind of categories, that they think that they refer to different aspects of reality. We created this question through focus groups that we did with scientists, and when we came across the independence category, we asked them what that meant to try to get a sense of the content, and they almost universally said this just means that there are different aspects of reality that they don't really meet. So this idea that they are non-overlapping. So here's what this looks like in the life of one physicist in Italy. She says this: no, there's no conflict. Science and religion are completely distinct because there's no connection between the physical reality described by science and the existence or not existence of God. Again, there is no intersection in the sense that science can explain. In other words, you will never be able to prove or disprove God. God is outside the reach and the limits of science. So we also look at this other view, just for the sake of discussion of collaboration. This is not the dominant view, but it certainly makes a strong minority showing. So especially in Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey, we see this collaboration view coming up quite prominently. So here is what this looks like in the life of one scientist in India. He says this: yes, religion, you can say that it inspires us to be disciplined. Like we're having prayers which have definite timings. That means that you have to get up early in the morning for the first prayer. The scientist is a Muslim. And then after that, late in the night. So that means there are 5 times which are fixed for the prayers. I mean, it's just one thing you can say, that if you're disciplined, so that is also one of the important factors when you're doing science. If you're disciplined, that will definitely help you. These interviews are really challenging my sense of what collaboration might mean in these different national contexts. I really like this quote, and it's representative of what other scientists think more broadly, because it's based around practice. It's not based around talking about abstract ideas. So often in the West, we talk about science and faith only in the idea realm. And I think social science helps us uncover the possibilities of the importance of practice. So for this Muslim scientist living in India, it was the kind of discipline that he understands through his faith tradition. And he went on and on about this, about how the practices in his faith as a Muslim helped his science and were generative to his science and actually allowed him to be more creative and disciplined. So a very different way of seeing the science and faith interface than I'm used to from my own vantage point of living in the US. Possibly my favorite question is this, because it really allows us to delve more deeply into these interviews, which I've just enjoyed so much. So we asked this question: does religion ever enter scientific work? And if so, how does it show up in scientific work? We found that even for those scientists who personally, in the way that they responded to the survey or the way that they talked to us when we had these face-to-face conversations with them, even those who thought there was a pretty entrenched conflict between religion and science, or those who thought that these were very independent realms, still brought up instances where religion entered scientific work. Sometimes they viewed that as not being a good thing, but honestly, they pretty much all said that under certain conditions, religion comes up in scientific work. It comes up through immigration. I talked to you some about the flows of people across national contexts, and that brought up some very interesting kinds of intricacies and difficulties in the scientific workplace when religious traditions that are not really part of a dominant culture come into the scientific workforce, and then scientists have to try to understand and live and work with people who are very religiously different than they are. Through ethics, scientists often appealed to religious traditions for ethical understanding, for ethical application of science, even if they were personally not at all religious. So many thought that science itself didn't hold an inherent moral framework for how to apply science in the world. And they talked quite extensively about that, sometimes appealing to religious traditions that they had not been part of or really thought about since their youth. And through interface with the public. For some types of science in particular, they need the public as research subjects, and like I do, and religion comes up in those kinds of situations, even for a scientist who's not personally religious. Sometimes there are protests on the part, like there's in the US sometimes, on a religious public is protesting some kind of scientific endeavor, and scientists then have to try to figure out, sometimes for the sake of their own funding, how to relate to a public that is more religious than they are, and these questions and these interactions become very real in the lives of scientists. Scientists are experiencing, in particular, the influx of Muslim immigrants into certain national contexts. This is happening quite a bit in France, where I'm living right outside of Geneva, Switzerland right now. So here's a physicist in France who says the following, and I like this picture. It's kind of a don't ask, don't tell picture, isn't it, that my postdoc took when he was interviewing people. I had an interview with a Muslim girl who wants to apply to come here. So I did an interview with her through Skype, but then I could see that she was a Muslim because she had the veil. We had a lab meeting, and then I said, okay, I interviewed this woman and stuff. She seems okay. And then I brought the issue that she was a Muslim with a veil. Some colleagues didn't want that in the lab. They think it will interfere with the work. And this physicist told me that they actually ended up not hiring this woman. So you think about religious traditions, Islam is a good case in point, where religious symbols sometimes, especially for women, are particularly visible, and more visible in a way that some cultures are not used to. And so these kinds of things cause sometimes conflict or difficulties relationally, and depending on how you look at it, even discrimination in the scientific workforce. They're a way that scientists need to learn how to deal with religion, and many of them don't have the vocabulary or the experience to know how to deal with this. In ethics, scientists, as I said before, often brought up religious frameworks, religious ideas when dealing with ethics. So here's a quote from a UK professor of biology. He said, religion provides a check on those occasions where you might be tempted to shortcut because you want to get something published. She talked on and on about the pressure to publish as a scientist. And you think, oh, that experience wasn't really good enough, but if I portray it in this way, then that will do. She was a very committed Anglican, and she said that her religious tradition provided her a kind of ethical check on her scientific work. When she was motivated to rush through things to get a publication out the door quickly, she was caused to actually step back and say, this is not the right thing to do. And an interface with the public. I like this quote from my biologist who's a lecturer in the UK. He says, I work with food, and sometimes the research work would involve tasting and analyzing samples that may not be compatible with everyone's religious background. So if I knew that a number of my participants would prefer halal meat because that's what their religion suggests, we would try to source halal and be clean about it. We would offer the choice not to participate if they feel that the samples are not compatible with their religious views. So she talked quite a bit in her particular study on enzymes that she was trying very hard to get different types of people involved in her study, and she had to take religion into consideration. If you read the abstract to this talk, I talked some about the UK and how I was going to talk specifically about the UK, since of course that's the context where we're sitting or standing right now. And the UK has been just a really wonderful, wonderful context to study. But I want to talk to you just for a few moments right now about 3 specific ways that religion is coming up in the scientific community in the UK. So here's a type of, I think there's a pointer on here. Here's a type of graph that, I would say if I just wave my arm around, then it will come. No, I may not be doing it right. Ah, you can see it. Okay, there we go. So you see that there are big differences. I talked to you a little bit about belief in God, but there are big differences between UK scientists and the UK general population. And you might think, if you're interested in seeing more fruitful dialogue between scientists and faith communities, the ways in which this might have an impact on dialogue. So in the UK, 65% of scientists say they don't belong to a religion. 50% of the general public says this. 68% never attend religious services, goes down to 47% for the general public. The idea that there's very little truth in any religion, 39% of scientists say that in the UK, 16% of the general public only. And then we have the God factors there. So these numbers I think are interesting, and we can talk about them later if you want to, especially for those of you who've had experience trying to sponsor these dialogues in faith communities, sort of what this means. But what was particularly interesting to our research team, so much so that we actually just published a research article on it, which has been talked about quite a bit in the UK press, is how scientists are responding to, I put new in quotes because it doesn't seem to me like it's particularly new anymore, that to atheist scientists who are pretty prolific writers. And I thought there's so many scientists who are atheists in the UK that, okay, that's fine. They would probably agree with the scientists who are writing prolifically as atheist scientists. But, and we didn't actually even ask them. We didn't think that was a super interesting question. But I remember when one scientist said to me, when I asked him about his belief in God, he actually said to me, have you spoken with Richard yet? And I was like, okay, I had no idea what he was talking about. Okay, I'll just admit it. So I don't usually think of scientists by their first names in these kind of contexts. Of course, he meant Richard Dawkins, who was actually a friend of his. And then he went on to talk about how he really did not like Richard Dawkins' methods. This scientist that I was interviewing was personally an atheist, but he really disagreed with these kind of methods. And still, we kept on with our study. We kept on interviewing scientists, and we didn't ask them at any point specifically about Richard Dawkins, and they kept bringing him up. They kept bringing him up, not in order to say that they agree with him or wanted to be like him. Even those atheist scientists brought him up as someone that they wanted to set a boundary against in terms of his methods and the ways that he interacts with the public. And so he wrote this article. It's called Responding to Richard, Celebrity and Misrepresentation of Science. It's in the Public Understanding of Science. It was just published. I'm happy to send send it to you if you want to email me, or you can look it up. So here's a UK professor of biology who says this. He says, some people like Richard Dawkins, and I think he's a fundamental atheist. He feels compelled to take the evidence way beyond that which other scientists would regard as possible. I want students to develop science in their own lives, and I think it's necessary to understand what science does and does not address directly. Here's another professor of biology, too, who says he's gone on a crusade. I think that it's an easy target, and I think that he's rather insensitive and hectoring. Although there's a lot of truth behind what he says, he does it in a way that I think is deliberately designed to alienate religious people. And so we talk about the various ways in which scientists brought up the new atheists more broadly, but Richard Dawkins in particular, and how they are concerned about the way in which science is being represented to the UK public. We found that particularly interesting. I also want to come back to the third thing, which I think has an impact on UK science, which is the role that immigration is playing in the religious character of science. There actually are not a lot of Muslims in science in the UK. So there are a lot of immigrants who are Muslims in the UK, and some are entering science, but there's not a huge proportion, depending on which discipline or subfield, maybe 6–8% of the scientific population at the most. But interestingly, the Muslims who are in science are generally, according to the scientists that we interviewed, practicing their faith quite readily. And so to these scientists, I love the quote from one scientist who says he loves being Anglican and going to church even though he's a scientist, because he says the Anglican church is an impotent church, and that's just fine with him. So I don't say I agree with him, but I'm just saying that's what he said. So what's been fun about these interviews is that in part we think the reason that UK scientists are mentioning Muslims so much is because they've not been that much exposed to people who really practice their religion, right? Who are serious about their faith tradition, and this is unusual to them, so they feel like they're just hugely represented. You'd think that 50% of the scientific population in the UK are Muslims from the way some of the UK scientists talk. So this is very interesting. Their perception is that the number is much greater than it is. So here's one quote from a biologist. So I should preface this by something else, by saying when we surveyed them that 65% of UK scientists think scholars in the UK are negative towards religion. So they think that there's a kind of negative context there. So, and that was borne out to some extent in our interviews. So here's a biologist who says, I had a Saudi Arabian student once. He was very, very devout Muslim. But I couldn't get him to repeat experiments. If the experiment didn't work the first time, well then Allah was directing him in a different direction. We didn't ever repeat something that didn't work because that was not exactly blasphemy, but it was being arrogant. It was going against the will of God. So scientists often brought up this idea that the students that they worked with, most of them Muslims, but others, they talked about other religious traditions as well in this way sometimes. They generally had this framing of those who practice their religion seriously as being a little bit concerning, right? It's fine if you have kind of a lukewarm religion, but if you have a religion that's more serious, a more serious matter, then that's perhaps a little bit concerning for science itself. So what do these kinds of results mean? And know that this is just the beginning. There's so much more that these data can tell us, and I hope will tell us as we gain more people who are interested in working with the data and start to analyze it more in our current research team. I think even at this very first glance that we get some new answers to old questions, some new insights. There's a kind of message to both scientists and both social and natural scientists really in these data. So scientists are often less religious than the general public in a specific national context. Sometimes they aren't, but most often they are in these 8 national contexts in particular. But we also find cases where this is definitely not true. And I do want you to think about the way in which the differences between scientists and the general population in a nation might have an impact on science and faith interface efforts. Another message to scholars who themselves, social scientists in particular, have often assumed that scientists will see faith and science in conflict. There's a kind of message that the majority of scientists see religion and science as independent or even having the possibility to collaborate. And I want to assert that even for those who have a convinced independence view, which that's the majority view, this sort of idea that these are non-overlapping entities, that empirically, I think this is really hard to pull off. So even if you have a non-overlapping view, you still run into religious people. So I had a privilege of talking to a sixth form class this morning, and some of them held the independent view. And I said, so here you are, you're a scientist, you're in your lab, you're either a religious scientist and you hold an independent view, or you're an atheist, or you're a non-religious scientist and you hold an independent view, and you work with a PhD student who's particularly religious and wants to talk about it in a way that has an impact on his or her scientific work. And all of a sudden, your independent view kind of goes out the window, right? You can believe these things in the abstract, but when you run into people who have a different view than you, you have to figure out how to deal with them in a social and relational context. It's very hard to keep these things distant, to keep science and faith completely distant in an intellectual, abstract sense when we're dealing with real people in everyday working situations. So I don't think it's right empirically in social contexts. It enters, as I said, through immigration, through ethics, and often through interface with the public. This is a lecture that is sponsored by Christians in Science, and I've had the privilege of presenting these materials in several specifically Christian contexts. And the people in churches that I've talked to have started to teach me how data like these can help them move forward in conversations that are specifically about the intersection between Christian faith and science. So here's some of the message there. I think for those of us who are Christians, we have vastly misunderstood atheism. Atheist scientists are not always hostile to religion. Some of them think of themselves as having spiritual sensibilities. And I think we need a more truthful understanding of the varieties of atheism that are around us, in some cultural contexts more than in others. But we need a more honest and open understanding of atheism. I think that'll go a long way towards increasing dialogue with the scientific community. Many scientists are religious. That's certainly the case. And of course, there are scientists who are specifically Christians, maybe even some of you in this room. I am finding through this particular research, but also through work that I've done in the U.S. science community and in the U.S. faith community, that often, even when scientists attend faith communities, when they attend churches, that they don't feel comfortable talking openly about their scientific work in their faith communities. And I think that lack of willingness to talk openly about scientific work within the context of faith communities has negative consequences on the science and faith dialogue, has negative consequences in particular for children who are starting to think through these things, who are starting to ask hard questions of the faith, and might stand a great deal to gain, and science itself by being made out to be a more appealing occupation if scientists could be pushed to talk more openly about their faith commitments and their scientific commitments within their particular faith communities. And that's something that I've come to feel quite passionately about, is that it's religious scientists themselves who may be the best bridge builders, both from the faith community to the scientific community, and both from the scientific community to the faith community. So we need lots more training and understanding of how they might learn how to connect these things. Here's a neurologist in India. I really like this quote. He says, that was a very small moment. I explained it in this way, that when you're doing something as a scientist, he was talking about a scientific work, and if you give 100% of yours, 100%, not 99.9%, if it's 100%, then you will call it God. That moment of euphoria where you've given 100% and you were seeing the results, that is what is meeting God. So I met with God on that particular day, and I don't know if it's never going to happen again. Another message to people of faith from these particular results is that both scientists and people of faith have the possibility of really coming together and seeing the beauty and awe of the scientific world. That there is just, I'm writing an article right now with a postdoctoral fellow about beauty and awe in science. And I think that that is a space where scientists, the very best scientists, see incredible beauty and awe, and almost science as an art form, a creative form in their scientific work. And I think some people of faith, too, have really seen a sense of beauty and awe in scientific work, and obviously those communities can overlap. We often use Richard Dawkins as a kind of abject negative example, but actually one of my favorite quotes of his is this: "The feeling of awed wonder that science can give us is one of the highest experiences of which the human psyche is capable. It is a deep aesthetic passion to rank with the finest that music and poetry can deliver." Let me end there. Thank you. I want to say briefly that I put up my own personal website, and if you're interested in this research and you'd like to get some articles that we've published from our research team, that you can go there. Everything that we publish, we make public access and put it there. And this is the Religion and Public Life program that I direct at my university, and we have some talks and things like that, which you might find of interest. These are some of the people that worked on this study. So,
thank you, Elaine. We have a microphone. We have some time for questions, so the floor is open. Put your hand up and you can get a microphone so that people can hear. Thank you.
yeah.
Hi there, thank you for the talk. I had two questions, if that's
Sure.
okay. The first one is just, if I'm interested to hear about your explanation for the Taiwan and China data.
Taiwan and Hong Kong.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right.
Taiwan
no, I
and
just
Hong
wanted
Kong
to
data.
make sure you knew
Yeah.
that. So there's a completely different, and those contexts are not the same, but I put them together because they both experience this kind of difference, which is different from the rest of the data, that scientists are about the same or a little bit even more religious than the general public. In Hong Kong in particular, and in Taiwan to some extent as well, there has been a historic Christian mission movement, the Catholic and Protestant Church, and we'll set that aside for a moment, but the important piece of that for this discussion is that they set up a lot of schools, and some of the best educational institutions have a specifically Christian flavor or worldview. And in Hong Kong, we met several scientists actually who describe it as the kind of Christian mafia of science. And I was like, whoa, that is really an interesting phrase right there, Christian mafia of science. I'm going to totally use that as a subtitle in something. And it was really fun for us to just see the difference that can make in the whole discussion. So again, the idea that there would be a conflict in scientific work was not, it just did not have the same flavor as it did in some of these other contexts. We're still exploring that, but that's one kind of working hypothesis which is being borne out in these interviews. In those contexts, we're paying particular attention to the interview data, which can help us uncover some of the intricacies. But your second question.
My second question was, so in countries where you were interviewing people of more than one faith, I'm curious to know whether you found more similarities between people of faith, so like people of one faith in one country and then people of that same faith in another country, or between the nationalities. So for example, does a Muslim scientist, the data in India have more in common with a Muslim scientist in Turkey, Muslim scientists in Turkey, or with Hindu scientists in India?
That is an awesome question that I don't know that I have an answer to, but I'll try to think up one on the spot. So here's what is happening in part. So remember that we're interviewing scientists. So another thing that I love it when you like ask the questioner another question. I'm not allowed to ask you a question, right? Okay, well let's not do that. But what I ask myself, say, is that sort of being a scientist is a particular kind of professional identity. And so I guess before the question you're asking, I'm asking, are scientists more like one another or more like the people in their national context religiously? So that's a sort of meta question, I think, that comes before your question. And the answer is yes to both of those, that there is, and under some conditions. So to some extent, they're very influenced by the people in their local culture, especially religiously. But in another sense, we find that they're all asking similar types of questions about religion as other scientists do. So being a scientist kind of bends you in a certain way and makes you ask certain kinds of questions. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, question over here.
Hi.
Hi.
My question is, I appreciate you may have had some resourcing, the huge study here, so you can't cover every single group. But the one group that stuck out that I thought wasn't represented that's significant is our Russian friends. To put that in context.
Oh, you mean national context? Russian.
Yeah, you've got a massive population there, and I appreciate there are stabilities and stuff. But to put that in context, Fedorov had a massive influence on Tsiolkovsky, very existential, philosophical, spiritual. It underpinned the entire Russian space program, way, way, way beyond the physics and the engineering. If anything, it was a thing that actually drove, and it's something that's not really that well known in the West, that it was a driving motivational force that was spiritual as opposed to technical. So I just wondered if the Russians were not available, or if you had a magic wand, maybe you would have done that.
I shouldn't say this again, but that's another great subtitle, isn't it, where the Russian's not available. But you're exactly right. So, and we didn't study anyone in Africa either, right? So there's just massive piece of the world. So I really don't want to advertise this as being a completely global view of scientists. I do think, we thought a lot about it, probably as much as I could have as a researcher, that we picked well as a beginning, but that there's a lot more to go. So what I hope to do is publish our entire methodological report so that others won't have to reinvent the wheel, and that we might have a kind of template for others to follow and then adapt to their particular national context. There is a group of interestingly Finnish social scientists, and I'm on their advisory board, who are starting to look at their context compared to Russia and some other Slavic contexts. And so that's sort of interesting. So our people are thinking about the kinds of things that you're thinking about. So it's kind of fun to see. Yeah, absolutely. I think you raise a great point. I think you raise a great point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as I remember the numbers, something like 22,000 were asked and 9,000 or so replied.
Yep.
Is there reason to think that those 13 or 12,000 who didn't reply might have been less open to, religion, faith dialogue, or might have thought there was more conflict, might have even thought it wasn't the kind of thing worth talking about? So the 9,000 you got might have been more open to the possibility of compatibility?
Absolutely. So that's a terrific question. So what you're talking about is non-respondent bias, right? And you can never know conclusively whether or not there was non-respondent bias. But here's some things that we did. So we gathered, remember I had those, I think we had 67 university students in the end who worked with me. We called them the scientist stalkers, because their job was to gather as much information actually at stage one. So going back to the whole sampling frame, the entire universe of people who could have been selected. So we gathered as much information as we could possibly gather about anything that may have to do with religion, may predict religion. So for example, gender is a really easy one, because in all societies and all places, women are more religious than men. And so we're like, well, okay, let's make sure we're not underrepresenting women in this sample. So we looked at factors that might have an impact. The other thing that you can do, and this is actually really tricky, so we didn't find for the usual demographic variables that there was a difference between non-respondents and respondents. We also did non-respondent interviews. So we paid the survey firms that we worked with it is a crazy thing to try to do. It doesn't work that well, but I'll tell you what we did. We paid them to try to, so first we harassed them to participate, and then we double harassed them to tell us why they didn't participate, right? So there's obviously some bias implicit there. But they're, actually, scientists are fascinating people, though. They love to, for people who are very busy, they love to write on and on about things. So they were amazingly willing to talk about why they didn't participate. It was sort of unusual compared to other studies I've done. I collected that up and wrote an article about it too, actually. And we didn't find so much ideas about conflict or non-conflict and their reasons for participating. But I think you ask a really good question and one that we've thought about. So I'm not entirely, the answer I'm giving is not entirely satisfactory, but know that we've thought a lot about that.
But what was the reason they didn't answer?
Some of them don't like surveys. So then, and there are disciplinary differences in not responding, slight disciplinary differences, not very significant ones. There are some gender differences, and we perceive that women scientists are overtaxed in the sense that they're on more committees, are doing more university work and things like that, and so that they may just be more likely to not participate in this type of thing when compared to men. And so we handled that by just taking more women into the sample. Does that make sense? Like we just kept taking more women, like oversampling more women. So in some disciplines, we almost took the entire universe, some subfields like, a really underrepresented field is physics, like a theorists of different fields. And so we took probably the entire universe of women who are theorists in physics for some of these countries. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Did you meet, sorry, did you meet any scientists who felt they could explain everything in the world and creation just in the terms of science?
Yes.
So they thought themselves very clever.
Mm-hmm. Do you have
Yes,
another?
we know.
Yeah, you have a follow-up
I think we all know a
question?
few of those.
yeah.
There's a question at the back.
Yeah. Those were short interviews. Yeah. Right. Very short. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and there's so much data. I look forward to seeing more work come out.
This was my reduced version of
Yeah.
the talk. Actually, as I was in, I was like, whoa, this is long. Okay, but yeah, go on.
Oh, very interesting. One thing I was interested in is how the public perceive the religiosity of scientists versus how religious they actually are.
If you hang around just a little bit longer, not in this room, but until 2017, I have a book coming out on that topic. But just in the U.S. So those of you who are out there looking for, PhD theses in the social sciences or things, I think there's lots to study in national contexts outside the U.S. But we did these focus groups and surveys and interviews with people in the U.S. from different religious traditions. And the funny thing is that, it's not funny, it's kind of sad, but that's religious people almost universally from different traditions. So even religious traditions that are overrepresented in science, so people who are Jewish are actually overrepresented in science quite a bit in the US. Even they think scientists are hostile to religious people. They think scientists are hostile even to Jewish people. They think scientists are hostile with their faith and other faiths. So there's a really widespread assumption that scientists are against religious people. But then when you interview scientists, they do not think that they are hostile to religious people. So there's a different understandings floating around, which I think has a lot of impact on how we think about faith communities and discussions of science. I started working really hard to translate some of my research to faith communities after getting these findings. I almost felt like I had a moral responsibility to do so because there are such vast misunderstandings of the scientific community.
I wonder if you came across any who identify themselves as Buddhists. I mean, real Buddhism is a fascinating expression of spirituality in a kind of non-theistic sense, and it might well affect attitudes between science and religion.
Absolutely, absolutely. So you may know this already, but Buddhism, I would say not a Buddhism that someone, say, who's a very committed practicing Buddhist in Thailand would recognize. But there is a sort of Buddhist sensibility, sociologists of religion would call it, in the US now. There's, I don't know how to put it differently. Buddhism is kind of hot, like in the US. Do you know this? Yeah, okay. So that came up quite a bit amongst the atheist scientists in particular and agnostic scientists in the US who were spiritual. They were saying that they were drawing on a kind of larger Buddhist tradition, and we tried to press them a bit on that in our interviews. And I don't mean to make light of it. It's just, it wasn't particularly important to them to know a lot about the tradition. It's just that they're sort of looking to Buddhist writings and teachings more in a meditation kind of sense, or just a general spiritual sense. There are serious practicing Buddhists in both Hong Kong and Taiwan, and that has come up quite a bit. And again, very similar to the some of those interviews we actually don't have translated yet, but similar to the very serious Hindus in India, this sense that that conflict is not something that you would respond to, or it's the kind of quizzical look that you get when you're interviewing a scientist and they're like, why are you asking me this question? I'm trying not to be disrespectful and I'll answer it, but it seems like a very silly question to me. So that's the kind of answer that you get. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Any other questions? Perhaps we'll have one last one. Did you have one? And then we'll adjourn downstairs for some refreshments.
Hello. So have you noticed any differences between biologists and physicists?
Yes, and I didn't get a chance to really talk about that. And I should have. In the UK, religion, particularly Christianity, shows up quite a bit more often among physicists than biologists. So it's perhaps because of Faraday, or there are these sort of outspoken, historic, and even present-day examples of physicists who are persons of faith, particularly Christians, who are trying to figure out how to live these things, who talk openly about it, who write about it. There are several books that have come out even in the last decade. Biology, not so much in the UK. In the US, where there's been so much public discussion about evolution, I would have thought that biologists would be much less religious than physicists in the US, and that's not the case. So that's sort of something that we're trying to figure out and is kind of puzzling. One hypothesis we have about some of the national contexts is that there may be gender differences in the disciplines that are floating in, but that's not really bearing out. Actually, women who go into science are quite different religiously than other women in the general population. So that's kind of interesting. Highly religious women in particular don't tend to go into science. So I'm trying to explore that. There's an interesting paper or study to be done on the interface between religion, science, and gender, which I think is probably unexplored. So those are some of the things that I have so far. Another difference, which I didn't talk about, is that we study the differences between highly research active universities and research institutes and what we would call less research active. I sometimes use the categories elite and non-elite. That's sometimes offensive to people to put it in those terms. So perhaps not here,
teaching
right?
And research, we would say more teaching universities and research universities.
We're at Cambridge, yeah, so I can say that. That's rude, I'm sorry. So there is actually quite a bit of difference between more research active and less research active. Less research active universities across these 8 national contexts tend to have scientists as part of them who are more religious, and the more elite contexts have less religious scientists. In the UK, that gap is not as wide as in some of the contexts. It's actually particularly wide in Turkey, but then again, the scientists in Turkey tend to be more religious than the scientists other places. So we're still working out some of the intricacies there. You didn't ask about that, you asked about physics and biology. That's what I have to say.
Well, thank you very much. As I said, there's refreshments and a bookstall downstairs. I'm sure you'll be willing to chat to people as well for the next half hour or so. So it just remains to thank Elaine very much again.
Thank you.